The billionaire sat alone at the long table, untouched food growing cold. Christmas lights sparkled around him, but not one voice filled the room. No family, no calls, no laughter, just silence and regret. Then the front door opened softly. A woman stepped in, holding a small boy's hand. They looked lost, unsure. The old man slowly looked up, and his entire life shifted in that moment. Before we begin, subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from, so we can bring more stories like these. Richard Coleman woke before dawn, the way he always did, even though there was nowhere he needed to be. The massive estate was silent, the kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful, just empty, too wide, too clean, too aware of itself. The ceilings were high enough to echo footsteps, but there were none. No laughter, no hurried voices, no one calling his name, just the faint hum of heat moving through marble walls. He sat up slowly in the king-sized bed that had never once felt like it belonged to two people, even back when it did. The sheets were smooth, tucked too perfectly, as if wrinkles were a failure. His body protested the movement, a stiff shoulder, a dull ache in his lower back, reminders that time didn't care how much money you had. Richard swung his legs over the side of the bed and rested his hands on his knees. Christmas Eve. The word meant nothing to him anymore. It hadn't for a long time. Outside, snow dusted the perfectly trimmed hedges, softening the sharp lines of the property. The grounds stretched far beyond what one man needed acres of land. Fountains frozen mid-splash, lights installed along the driveway that no one ever admired because no one ever came. He stood and crossed the room barefoot, stopping in front of the tall window. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, a tall man still, posture straight out of habit, hair silvered, face lined not by age alone, but by years of restraint. Richard Coleman, billionaire, visionary, self-made and alone. Downstairs, staff would already be moving quietly, trained to exist without being seen. They'd prepared breakfast he wouldn't touch, decorations he'd told them not to put up. A tree stood somewhere in the house, small, unlit, decorative enough to check a box. He'd canceled everything else. No gala, no charity dinner, no foundation event. This year, he'd told them he wanted quiet. The truth was simpler. He didn't want reminders. He dressed slowly, methodically, like every day was a board meeting, even though there were no meetings scheduled. Crisp slacks, a sweater instead of a suit jacket. He paused when his fingers brushed a cufflink in the drawer. Gold, engraved with initials he hadn't worn in decades. He closed the drawer. In the hallway, portraits lined the walls. Not family photos, achievements. Buildings he'd commissioned. Awards, magazine covers framed in glass. Headlines praising his brilliance. There were no pictures of people smiling with him. No arms around shoulders, no candid moments, no warmth. As he descended the staircase, his footfalls echoed, each step reminding him just how big the house really was. When he reached the living room, he stopped. The fireplace was lit. The staff must have turned it on early. The flames danced, reflected in the polished stone. He stood there for a long moment, staring at it, and a memory slipped in uninvited. A smaller fire, a cramped living room, a woman sitting cross-legged on the floor, laughing while trying to wrap presents with paper that kept tearing. "You don't need to make everything perfect," she'd said, smiling up at him. "Just make it honest." He turned away sharply. That life was gone, had been for years. He moved into the kitchen, where breakfast waited untouched. A housekeeper stood nearby, eyes lowered. "Good morning, Mr. Coleman." He nodded once, morning, She hesitated. "Would you like—" "No," he said gently but firmly. "You can go." She left without another word. He sat at the long dining table alone, the chair across from him empty, the others unused. He didn't eat. He never did on days like this. Food tasted like obligation. Instead, he folded his hands and stared at the place setting in front of him. Another flashback surfaced, not warm this time. A younger Richard at a long table, voices raised, partners arguing. Contracts being signed, someone storming out. "You don't listen anymore." A man had snapped. "You don't see people, only outcomes." Richard had won that argument. He'd won most of them. He'd won so much that there was no one left to argue with. By mid-morning, snow had thickened. The estate gates stood tall and closed. Iron bars dusted white, separating his world from everyone else's. That was the point, or at least, that's what he'd told himself. He moved to his study, the one room that still felt familiar. Shelves lined with books he'd read once and never touched again. A desk positioned just so, papers stacked neatly even when there was nothing urgent to handle. He sat, opened a drawer, and pulled out an old envelope he'd never thrown away. Inside was a faded photograph. Him, a woman, much younger. They were standing outside a modest house, her head resting on his shoulder, both of them laughing at something the camera couldn't capture. He studied her face carefully, like it might change if he looked long enough. "I did it," he murmured to the empty room. "Everything you said I could." But she wasn't there to hear it. By afternoon, the staff moved about preparing for a night that wasn't going to happen. No guests, no music, no countdown to midnight. Richard watched from the balcony as snow continued to fall. He told himself he preferred it this way. No expectations, no disappointments. That's when the intercom chimed. Once, then again, the sound cut through the quiet sharply, almost rudely. Richard frowned. No one was expected. Deliveries had been canceled. Security rarely bothered him unless it mattered. He pressed the button on the wall. "Yes," the voice crackled through, hesitant. "Sir, there's someone at the gate." "Who?" Richard asked, irritation creeping in. "A woman," the guard replied, "and a child." Richard closed his eyes briefly. "I told you." "I know, sir," the guard said quickly. "But the weather's getting worse." The car outside looked stalled. Richard exhaled slowly. Call a service, he thought. Give them directions to a shelter. That was enough. That was reasonable. That was clean. Handle it, he said. He released the button, then faintly, through the intercom still open, he heard a small voice. "Mom, is this Santa's house?" The words landed somewhere deep and unexpected. Richard's hand stilled. He hadn't heard a child's voice in his home in how long? The guard hesitated audibly. "Sir?" Richard didn't answer right away. In his mind, 1,000 excuses lined up. Not his responsibility. Security risk. Appearances. Boundaries. He'd built his life on boundaries. But something about that voice, curious, hopeful, not afraid, cracked through the walls he'd reinforced for decades. He pressed the intercom again. "Bring them to the side entrance," he said quietly, "just for now." The guard sounded surprised. "Yes, sir." Richard stepped back from the wall, heart beating a little faster than it should have. He didn't know why he'd said yes. He told himself it was temporary, just until the storm passed, just for the night. But deep down, in a place he rarely allowed himself to feel, something stirred. The house that had been silent for so long was about to hear footsteps that weren't paid for. And Richard Coleman, a man who had everything except what mattered, had no idea that Christmas was already finding its way in. The wind cut through Laura Bennett's coat like it wasn't even there. She stood just outside the iron gates, one gloved hand gripping the strap of her worn backpack, the other resting gently on her son's shoulder. Snow gathered in her hair, melting slowly and running down her neck. Her boots were soaked through, toes numb, legs aching from standing too long and walking too far. Behind her, their car sat crooked near the road, hood dusted white, hazard lights long dead. Inside the car were all the things she hadn't been able to bring herself to throw away: a blanket that smelled like home, a box of crayons Ethan refused to part with, a folded grocery receipt she kept meaning to check and never did. In front of her stood the gate, tall, cold, heavy. Money lived behind gates like this. Ethan tilted his head back, eyes wide as he looked up at the towering iron bars. Snowflakes landed on his eyelashes, and he blinked them away. "Mom," he whispered, voice soft like he was afraid the house might hear him. "Is this where rich people live?" Laura forced a small smile, even as her chest tightened. "I guess so, baby. Do you think they'll help us?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Hope was a dangerous thing, especially when you were tired. Earlier that evening, she'd tried everything else. The shelter on Maple Street was full. The church basement had already laid out all its cots. Her phone battery had dropped to single digits as she searched for numbers she could barely remember. And then she remembered the name, Richard Coleman. Years ago, when Ethan was just a toddler, she'd stood in line at a winter outreach program, coats, soup, toys handed out in paper bags. Someone had said it was funded by a local businessman who never showed his face. That's him. A volunteer had whispered. The one with the big estate. Back then, she hadn't thought much of it. Tonight, she had nowhere else to go. She pressed the intercom with a shaking finger. Nothing happened at first. Ethan shifted closer to her, his small body trying to shield her from the wind, even though he needed the warmth more than she did. "Mom, it's really cold," he said quietly. "I know." She whispered back, "Just hold on." Inside the mansion, staff froze as the image from the security camera filled the monitor. A woman, a child, snow thick enough to blur the edges of the screen. One of the guards frowned. "It's Christmas Eve," he muttered. "We should call someone." Another shook his head. "Mr. Coleman said no disturbances tonight. But it's a kid." Before anyone could decide, the intercom crackled to life. "Bring them to the side entrance," Richard's voice said. The room went silent. "Did he?" Someone started. "Yes," the guard said quickly. "He did." Laura didn't know what had changed. All she knew was that the gate clicked. Slowly, deliberately, it opened. Her breath caught. A guard stepped out, motioning them forward. "This way, ma'am." She hesitated, instinct screaming at her that nothing in life came without a cost. But Ethan squeezed her hand. "See," he whispered. "I told you someone would open the door." They followed the guard along a curved drive, their footsteps crunching softly in the snow. The mansion loomed closer with every step, stone walls, tall windows glowing warm from inside. Ethan's eyes sparkled. "Mom, it's like a castle." Laura swallowed hard. When the door opened, warmth rushed over them, almost overwhelming. The smell of clean wood, something faintly citrus, something expensive she couldn't name. She stepped inside and immediately felt too loud, too small, too out of place. Richard Coleman stood at the far end of the entryway, not looming, not angry, just still. He was taller than she expected, posture straight despite his age. His hair was silver, his expression unreadable. He looked at them like he was studying something fragile, he wasn't sure how to touch. Laura pulled Ethan closer. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said quickly, words tumbling out. "We didn't mean to intrude. Our car broke down and the shelters are full, and I just thought." "That's fine," Richard said, voice calm but distant. "You can stay until the storm passes." Relief hit her so fast her knees nearly gave out. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Ethan stepped forward without fear, snow melting onto the marble floor. "Hi," he said cheerfully. "I'm Ethan." Richard blinked. No one ever introduced themselves to him anymore. "I'm Richard," he said after a moment. Dinner was awkward. Laura perched on the edge of her chair, apologizing every time Ethan spoke too loudly, every time he asked a question, every time he stared in open wonder at the chandelier or the staircase or massive windows. "I'm sorry," she said for what felt like the 100th time. "He doesn't mean to." "It's fine," Richard replied, though his plate remained mostly untouched. Ethan ate quietly, hands wrapped around his fork, clearly aware that this was not a place for crumbs or messes. He glanced around between bites, eyes curious. "Do you live here all by yourself?" he asked. Laura stiffened. "Ethan." "Yes," Richard answered before she could stop him. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "That's a lot of house for one person." Richard didn't respond. Staff lingered at a distance, whispering behind careful expressions. "Why are they here? This isn't appropriate. What if something happens?" Richard heard none of it. He was too focused on the sound of a child's voice, echoing softly through rooms that hadn't heard laughter in years. After dinner, Ethan wandered closer to the fireplace, warming his hands. "Sir?" he asked suddenly. Richard looked up. "Why do you have so much space but no pictures of people?" The question sliced clean through the room. Laura's breath caught, staff froze, Richard didn't move. No one had asked him anything like that in decades. He opened his mouth, closed it. The fire crackled loudly. He stopped, cleared his throat. "That's the long story." Ethan nodded seriously. "My mom says stories matter." Laura felt tears sting her eyes. Richard turned away, staring into the flames, chest tightened. In a way he didn't recognize right away. Space without people, a house without warmth, a life without witnesses. For the first time that night, the mansion didn't feel large. It felt empty. The mansion had survived wars, recessions, scandals, and storms, but it had never known discomfort like this. Laura felt it the moment she sat down, the weight of eyes that weren't looking directly at her, but never really looked away either. The staff moved quietly, too quietly, like they were afraid any sudden motion might shatter whatever fragile permission had been granted for her and Ethan to be there. She kept her shoulders tight, posture straight, hands folded in her lap the way her mother had taught her when she was a girl visiting places she didn't belong. Ethan, on the other hand, didn't understand rules like that yet. He sat at the long dining table, legs swinging beneath the chair that was clearly built for adults who never fidgeted. His eyes moved everywhere, the tall ceilings, the polished silverware, the painting on the far wall that looked sad for reasons he couldn't explain. "So you live here all the time?" he asked again, voice bouncing lightly off the marble. Laura winced. "Ethan, it's okay," Richard said, though his voice was distant, distracted. "Yes," he repeated, "all the time. That must get lonely," Ethan said simply. The words landed without malice, without judgment, just truth. Richard's jaw tightened. Lonely wasn't the word he used. He preferred private, undisturbed, in control. Lonely sounded weak. Lonely sounded like something he had failed at. Laura cleared her throat. "He's just curious. He doesn't mean I know, Richard interrupted quietly. Dinner continued, but it wasn't really dinner. Richard barely touched his food. Laura ate only enough to be polite. Ethan, sensing something serious had entered the room, slowed down too, chewing carefully. The silence stretched. Too long. Finally, Ethan broke it again. "Do you celebrate Christmas here?" he asked. The room went still. One of the staff members glanced nervously toward Richard. Another lowered her eyes completely. Richard didn't answer right away. "No," he said eventually. "I don't." Ethan frowned. "Why not?" Laura reached for her son's arm this time. "Sweetheart, you don't have to. It's all right," Richard said again. He leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the table, beyond the room. "I stopped celebrating a long time ago. Because of work," Ethan asked. Richard almost smiled. Something like that. Laura felt a strange ache settle in her chest. She recognized that tone, the voice people used when the real answer hurt too much to say out loud. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing this. "My mom still tries," he said, "even when stuff goes wrong." Laura swallowed hard. "Ethan," she said softly, "go warm up by the fire." He obeyed, but not before turning back one last time. "You should try again," he said to Richard. "Christmas, I mean. It's better when you don't do it alone." The words followed Richard long after the boy walked away. A staff member leaned toward Richard, lowering his voice. "Sir, the board will not like this." Richard didn't look at him. "They're here for the night." "Yes, but appearances." "I said they're here for the night." Richard repeated, firmer now. The staff member nodded and stepped back. Laura caught the exchange and felt her stomach knot. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said quickly. "We can leave in the morning, early, before anyone. You'll stay until the storm passes," Richard said, standing up abruptly. "That's all." He turned and walked toward the large windows overlooking the snow-covered grounds. Laura watched his back. For a man who owned everything he could see, he looked smaller than she expected. Later that evening, as the staff retreated and the mansion settled into a quiet hum, Laura tucked Ethan into a guest bed that probably cost more than her car. He curled under the heavy blankets, eyes already drooping. "Mom," he whispered. "Yes, baby." Richard looked sad. She brushed his hair back gently. "Sometimes people forget how to let others in." Ethan yawned. "I hope he doesn't forget tonight." Laura sat there for a while after he fell asleep, listening to the faint sound of footsteps echoing through halls too big for one heart. Downstairs, Richard stood alone in the grand living room. He stared at the mantel. No stockings, no photos. No cards, just empty space. The board member's warning echoed in his head. "This isn't appropriate. This looks weak. This could affect confidence." Then, from somewhere down the hallway, he heard it. Laughter, soft, childlike, unforced. Ethan, half asleep, giggling at something Laura whispered to him. The sound traveled through the mansion like something alive. Richard closed his eyes. For the first time in years, the silence he'd built around himself cracked. Not from anger, not from loss, but from the presence of people who didn't care who he was, only that he was there. The mansion had grown quieter after dinner. Not the stiff, echoing quiet it usually carried, the kind that reminded Richard Coleman of empty hallways and years passing without anyone noticing, but a different quiet. Softer, uncertain, like a house holding its breath. Laura sat on the edge of the guest sofa, hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes darting around the massive living room, as if she were afraid to touch anything with her gaze. Everything looked expensive in a way that made her feel small. The polished floors, the heavy drapes, the fireplace that probably cost more than her old car ever did. Ethan, meanwhile, sat cross-legged on the rug, completely unbothered by wealth or status. He had discovered a globe tucked into a corner near a bookshelf and was spinning it slowly with one finger, watching continents blur. "Mom," he whispered loudly, "this thing got the whole world on it." Laura smiled nervously. "Lower your voice, baby." Richard watched them from across the room, standing near the fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back, like a man inspecting his own life from a distance. He had let them in. He still wasn't sure why. Laura finally cleared her throat. "Mr. Coleman, I just want to say thank you again. We won't be any trouble. We'll leave first thing in the morning." Richard nodded once. "You're safe for the night," he said, voice formal. "That's all that matters." But it wasn't all that mattered. He knew it, and somehow so did she. Ethan looked up from the globe. "You live here all by yourself?" Richard hesitated. "Yes," he answered after a beat. Ethan frowned, not judgmental, just curious. "That's a lot of rooms for one person." Laura winced. "Ethan, it's all right," Richard said, surprising even himself. "He's right." Ethan tilted his head. "Don't you get lonely." The word landed harder than Richard expected. Lonely. He'd spent decades convincing himself he preferred solitude. That people were distractions. That emotions were liabilities. That loneliness was just weakness dressed up as sentiment. But hearing it from a child, plain, unfiltered, without accusation, cracked something open. Richard didn't answer. Laura spoke instead, softly. "My son asks honest questions, sometimes too honest." Richard gave a faint smile. "Those are usually the most important ones." Ethan scooted closer, still holding the globe. "My mom says money can buy stuff, but it can't buy hugs. Is that true?" Richard's jaw tightened. Laura froze. "Ethan, please, no." Richard said gently, "Let him talk." The boy shrugged. "I just think it's weird to have so much space and no pictures." That did it. Richard turned away from them, walking toward the far wall where a massive oil painting hung, abstract, expensive, meaningless. His reflection stared back at him in the glass frame. An old man in a tailored sweater, shoulders stiff, eyes tired. "No pictures," Richard murmured. He hadn't noticed until now. No family portraits, no candid smiles. No holidays frozen in time, just art, awards, certificates, plaques with his name etched in gold. Proof of success. Evidence of absence. Laura stood slowly. "If that was too much, I'm sorry. He doesn't mean, he means everything." Richard interrupted quietly. He turned back, his expression different now, not cold, not guarded, exposed. "I used to have pictures," he said. "A long time ago." Ethan's eyes widened. "What happened to em?" Richard exhaled slowly, like someone finally setting down a heavy load. "I chose work," he said, over and over. "I told myself I'd make time later." Laura felt something twist in her chest. She knew that tone. She'd lived that regret herself. "My wife used to say I was building an empire for people who weren't there to enjoy it." Richard continued. "I didn't listen." He paused. "She passed before I learned how." The room fell silent. Ethan stood and walked over, holding the globe out toward him. "You can still add pictures," he said simply. Richard looked down at the small hands offering him the world. "I don't have anyone left to put in them," he replied. Laura spoke before she could stop herself. "Sometimes people don't leave. Sometimes we push them." Richard met her gaze. She wasn't accusing him. She wasn't impressed by him. She wasn't afraid of him. She was just human. "I pushed everyone," he admitted. "Family, friends, partners. I thought strength meant standing alone." Ethan frowned. My mom says strength means asking for help. Laura blinked, surprised. I never taught you that. Ethan shrugged. You showed me. Richard felt his throat tighten. For the first time in years, no one wanted anything from him. No contracts, no influence, no donations, just honesty. I haven't celebrated Christmas properly in decades, Richard said. It became inconvenient. Laura's voice softened. Christmas isn't about convenience. No, Richard agreed. It's about connection. Ethan looked around the room. You got a tree. Richard almost laughed. Almost. No, he said. I canceled all decorations this year. Ethan considered this. We can make one. Laura smiled faintly. We don't need much. Richard hesitated, the old reflex kicking in, the instinct to shut things down before they mattered. But the sound of Ethan's laughter earlier, the warmth creeping into a house that had been cold for years. All right, Richard said finally. One small tree. Ethan beamed. Laura exhaled, relief washing over her. Thank you. Richard nodded. Thank you for reminding me. Later that night, as staff quietly brought in a modest tree and set it near the window, Richard stood watching from the hallway. The mansion didn't feel like a museum anymore. It felt awake. And for the first time in a long time, Richard Coleman wondered if the greatest deal he ever made had nothing to do with money at all. The mansion didn't change all at once. It changed in pieces, quiet ones, small sounds Richard Coleman hadn't heard in years. Laughter, not the polite, measured chuckles from boardrooms or charity galas, not the stiff smiles of people trying to impress him. This laughter was unfiltered, sharp and bright, echoing down hallways that had only ever carried the sound of footsteps and orders. It came from Ethan. Richard stood near the top of the grand staircase, unseen, listening. The boy was racing down the hall in his socks, pretending the carp. It was ice. He slid, laughed, almost fell, then caught himself and laughed harder. Laura called after him in a whisper shout. Ethan, baby, careful, you're gonna break your neck. I won't, Ethan said confidently. This house is too big. It'll catch me. Richard pressed his hand lightly against the banister. This house is too big. He'd said that himself once, not out loud, but in his head. Too big for one man. Too quiet, too empty. Below, staff moved differently now, not rushed, not stiff, not afraid of being seen. Someone had pulled a small, artificial tree from storage, one Richard didn't even remember approving. It stood near the window, modest and a little crooked, but decorated with soft white lights. No gold ornaments, no branded ribbons, just simple glass bulbs and a string of popcorn Ethan had insisted on helping with. A housekeeper named Marisol knelt beside him, guiding his hands. Careful, Mijo, it'll break. It won't, Ethan said again. I'm gentle. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. Gentle. That wasn't a word people ever used for him. Laura stood nearby, arms folded loosely, watching her son with a tired but genuine smile. She looked out of place in the mansion, worn boots, old coat folded over a chair, but she also looked grounded, like she belonged anywhere kindness existed. Richard cleared his throat quietly. Laura looked up and startled. Oh, Mr. Coleman, I didn't hear you. That's all right, he said. I didn't mean to interrupt. Ethan waved. We're making Christmas. Richard nodded. I see that. For a moment, he just stood there, unsure what to do with his hands. He'd commanded rooms full of executives without hesitation. But this felt harder. Laura spoke gently. We can stop if you want. We don't want to, no, Richard said quickly, Too quickly, he softened his tone. No, it's fine. It's good. She studied him, sensing something real beneath the formality. From somewhere deeper in the mansion, a phone rang. Richard stiffened. He already knew who it would be. He turned away, walking toward his private study, the warmth from the living room fading with every step. The door shut softly behind him, sealing him back into familiar territory: dark wood, leather chairs, framed headlines. The phone rang again. He answered. "This better be important," he said flatly. "Richard," came the voice of Thomas Ellery, a longtime board member. Sharp, displeased. "I'm hearing things." Richard closed his eyes. "It's Christmas Eve." "That doesn't stop rumors." Thomas snapped. "Staff talk. Security talks. Someone saw a woman and a child staying overnight." Richard leaned back in his chair. And it looks bad," Thomas said. "This isn't a shelter. You're opening yourself up to liability. Optics matter." Richard's jaw tightened. "They're guests. They're strangers," Thomas corrected. "And you're not thinking clearly." Richard's fingers curled slowly into a fist. "I'm thinking just fine." A pause. Then Thomas lowered his voice. "You've built too much to risk it over sentiment. You've spent years protecting your image. Don't unravel it now." Richard thought of Ethan's laughter bouncing off marble walls. "My image," he said quietly, "has cost me everything I ever cared about." "That's not. I won't have them removed." Richard said firmly, "This conversation is over." Thomas exhaled sharply. "You're making a mistake." Richard hung up. The silence in the study pressed in on him, heavy, familiar, safe, and suddenly unbearable. He stood abruptly and walked back toward the living room. As he reached the doorway, he stopped. Ethan was standing on a chair, carefully placing a crooked paper star at the top of the tree. Laura held the chair steady. Staff hovered nearby, not interfering, just watching, smiling. Someone had turned on soft Christmas music. Old carols, the kind Richard hadn't heard since childhood. The house felt alive. Richard felt something shift deep in his chest. He cleared his throat again. Ethan looked over. "Sir, you wanna help?" Richard blinked. "Help with what?" Ethan hopped down. "Decorating. Everybody's got a help. That's how it works." Richard hesitated. Decades of power had taught him how to control rooms. Not how to join them. Laura smiled encouragingly. "It's okay if you don't want to." Richard took a slow breath, then stepped forward. "What do I do?" he asked. Ethan grinned. "Here." He handed Richard a single ornament. Plain, red, slightly chipped. Richard turned it over in his fingers. He walked to the tree and hung it carefully. The room didn't erupt in applause. No one clapped. No one made a big deal. And somehow that made it matter more. Later, as the night settled in, Richard sat alone in the hallway outside his bedroom. He hadn't gone to sleep yet. Neither had they. Ethan's laughter echoed faintly again, followed by Laura's soft voice telling him it was time to rest. Richard closed his eyes. For the first time in years, the mansion didn't feel like a monument to what he'd lost. It felt like a place where something might still grow, and that terrified him, because now he knew what was at stake. And he wasn't sure he was strong enough to lose it again. The mansion had finally gone quiet. Not the hollow, echoing silence Richard Coleman had lived with for years, but a deeper, heavier stillness. The kind that comes after emotion has been stirred and hasn't yet settled. The kind that presses against your chest when the day has taken more out of you than you were ready to give. It was well past midnight. Snow brushed softly against the tall windows. catching the glow of the city lights far below. Somewhere down the hall, Ethan's door creaked as Laura checked on him one last time. Her footsteps were careful, respectful, like she knew this place still wasn't hers. Richard sat alone in his private sitting room, the lights dimmed low. He hadn't joined them for hot chocolate, hadn't stayed for the second round of decorating. He'd told himself he needed rest. That wasn't the truth. The truth was simpler and harder. His chest felt tight, not pain exactly, more like pressure, like something old and heavy had decided tonight was the night it wanted to be felt. He loosened his collar and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Get it together, he told himself. You've handled worse than this. But this wasn't a hostile takeover. It wasn't betrayal in a boardroom. It wasn't a market crash or a lawsuit. This was warmth, and it scared him more than anything else ever had. A dull ache bloomed beneath his sternum. He inhaled slowly, exhaled again. The ache didn't leave. He stood intending to get water. But halfway across the room, his breath caught sharply. He grabbed the edge of a table, knuckles whitening. Damn it, he muttered. The room tilted slightly, just enough to make him sit back down hard. He pressed a hand to his chest now. This time, the pain answered. Sharp, insistent, a warning. For the first time in decades, Richard Coleman felt afraid. Not of dying alone. Down the hall, Laura was just pulling a blanket over Ethan when she heard something she didn't expect. A sound that didn't belong in a house like this. A chair scraping, a short, broken breath. She froze. Her instincts, honed by years of surviving alone, kicked in immediately. She stepped quietly into the hallway. Mr. Coleman, she called softly. No answer. Her heart thudded faster. She followed the sound toward the private sitting room and stopped at the doorway. Richard was slumped in the chair, one hand gripping his chest, the other braced on the armrest. His face was pale, jaw clenched, breathing uneven. Sir, she said, voice calm but urgent. Hey, can you hear me? He looked up at her slowly. I'm fine, he said, though the lie barely held together. Laura stepped fully into the room, closing the distance without hesitation. No, she said gently, you're not. She knelt in front of him, not as a guest, not as someone intimidated, but as someone who'd sat beside hospital beds before. Someone who knew what fear looked like when it tried to hide. Where does it hurt? She asked. He hesitated. Pride flickered, then lost. Here, he said quietly, pressing his chest again. Laura nodded. Okay, we're gonna slow this down. She reached for the phone on the table, already dialing emergency services. Richard caught her wrist weakly. Don't make a scene. She met his eyes. This isn't a scene, she said firmly. This is your life. He let go. As she spoke calmly into the phone, Richard focused on her voice. Steady, clear, grounding. Help was on the way. Laura turned back to him. I need you to breathe with me, in through your nose, slow. He tried, failed. She adjusted, softer now. Okay, then just listen. I'm right here. Footsteps sounded in the hallway staff, alerted by the call. Laura raised a hand without looking away from Richard. Please give him space. They did, because something about the way she spoke carried authority. Not money, not power, care. From down the hall, Ethan's door creaked open. Mom, he whispered. Laura glanced back. Stay there, baby. Ethan stepped into the doorway anyway, eyes wide. He saw Richard hunched forward, saw the worry on his mother's face. Without being told, he walked closer. Sir, Ethan said quietly. Richard looked up. The boy stood beside him now, small hand reaching out uncertainly. Are you hurting? Ethan asked. Richard nodded once. Ethan took his hand. It was warm, small, steady. "You're not alone tonight," Ethan said. "Okay." Something inside Richard finally broke. His breath hitched, not from pain, but from emotion crashing through decades of restraint. "I thought I'd be," he admitted hoarsely. Ethan shook his head. "Nope, you got us." Sirens sounded faintly in the distance. Richard squeezed the boy's hand gently. "Thank you," he whispered. The paramedics arrived swiftly, efficient and respectful. Vitals checked, oxygen applied, questions asked. Laura answered most of them. Stress. Induced cardiac episode, they said. Not a full heart attack, but close enough to scare him straight. If no one had been here, one paramedic murmured quietly, this could have gone very differently. Richard caught that. He closed his eyes. As they prepared to transport him, Richard looked at Laura. "I didn't even know your last name," he said faintly. She smiled sadly. "Laura Bennett." "Laura," he repeated. "You stayed." She shrugged lightly. "People do that." He shook his head. "Not like you did." As they wheeled him toward the ambulance, Ethan jogged alongside. "You gotta get better," he said seriously. "We still got a open presence." Richard smiled weakly. "I'll try." Christmas morning came softly. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating the small tree still glowing faintly from the night before. Richard lay in bed, monitored but stable. The doctors had cleared him to rest at home, with strict instructions. He stared at the ceiling, absorbing what could have happened, what almost had. A knock came at the door. Laura peeked in. "You awake?" "Yes," he said. Ethan followed her in, holding a small, unevenly wrapped gift. "We made this," he said proudly, "for you." Richard sat up slowly. Inside the paper was a simple ornament, a paper star with his name written crookedly across it. Richard's vision blurred. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. Laura shook her head. "You opened the door. That counts." Richard held the ornament carefully. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry, not out of loss, but out of gratitude. Christmas morning arrived quietly. Not with trumpets or crowds or flashing cameras, but with soft light spilling across the marble floors and the smell of coffee drifting through a house that hadn't known mornings like this in decades. Richard Coleman woke slowly. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then he remembered everything at once. The child's hand in his, Laura's steady voice, the paramedic's words. If no one had been here, he sat up carefully, pressing a hand to his chest. Sore, tender, but alive, very much alive. Outside his bedroom window, the city shimmered in pale winter light. Snow rested on rooftops like a promise instead of a threat. A gentle knock came at the door. "Mr. Coleman," Laura's voice, cautious. "Are you awake?" "Yes," he answered. "Please come in." Laura stepped inside first, followed closely by Ethan, who was already wearing a Santa hat that slid sideways over one eye. "You look better," Laura said, relief washing over her face. "I feel different," Richard replied, "like I was given back something I didn't know I'd lost." Ethan climbed onto the edge of the chair near the bed. "You scared us," he said seriously. Richard smiled faintly. "I scared myself too." There was a pause, one of those gentle, comfortable silences that had somehow become normal in less than a day. Then Richard spoke. "I want you both to stay," he said. Laura blinked. "Oh, we didn't want to overstay. We can leave today." "Truly, no," Richard said, firmer now. "Not just today, longer." Her shoulders tensed. "Mr. Coleman." "Richard," he corrected softly. "Please." She nodded slowly. "Richard, we don't need charity." "I'm not offering charity," he said. I'm offering family, if you'll let me. Ethan's eyes widened. Like for real? Richard chuckled quietly, as real as it gets. He took a breath, choosing his words carefully, something he'd once done only in boardrooms. I've spent my life building systems, he said, companies, structures, control, but none of it meant anything last night when my heart started failing. He looked directly at Laura. You didn't see a billionaire. You saw an old man who needed help, and you stayed. Laura's voice trembled. Anyone would have. No, Richard said gently. They wouldn't have. Ethan leaned forward. Does this mean we're having Christmas? Richard smiled, really smiled. For the first time in years. Yes, he said, I believe it does. Later that morning, staff gathered in the living room, not out of obligation, but curiosity. The small tree still stood by the window, lights glowing softly. Someone had added a few more ornaments overnight. Someone else had laid out simple wrapped gifts beneath it. Richard walked in slowly, supported by a cane he hadn't needed yesterday, but accepted today. The room fell quiet. I canceled Christmas this year, he said calmly. That was a mistake. He turned toward Laura and Ethan. These two reminded me what this day is for. He looked at his staff, people who'd known him for years, but never like this. I'm reopening the community winter programs, he continued, effective immediately. Shelters, heating assistance, family support. Murmurs rippled through the room. And, he added, we'll be establishing a new foundation, one focused entirely on single parents and displaced families. Laura stiffened. Richard, no names, he said quickly, no press, no strings. He met her eyes, just help. She swallowed hard, emotion tightening her throat. Thank you, Richard shook his head. Thank you. Later, after gifts were opened, simple things that somehow felt priceless, Richard sat beside Ethan on the rug. You know, Ethan said thoughtfully, this house doesn't feel so big anymore. Richard nodded. It finally feels full. Laura watched them, something healing quietly inside her. Richard turned to her. There's one more thing I'd like to ask. She tensed again. Okay. I don't want to be a benefactor, he said. I don't want to be a savior. I've played those roles before. He hesitated, vulnerable now. I'd like to be present, if you'll allow it. She searched his face. You mean in Ethan's life? Yes, Richard said. Only if you're comfortable. Laura thought of the cold nights. The shelters turned full. The way this man had opened his door without knowing who she was. She nodded. I think that would mean a lot to both of us. Richard exhaled, a weight lifting from his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone by choice. He was chosen. Morning didn't rush in. It arrived gently, like it knew this house had waited a long time to feel whole again. Sunlight slipped through the tall windows, landing softly on the polished floors, warming corners that had lived too long in shadow. The mansion, once cold, echoing, oversized, felt different now, not smaller, just human. Richard Coleman stood near the window, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. He watched the light move across the room, the way he used to watch stock numbers rise and fall on screens. Only this felt heavier. Better. Behind him, laughter broke the quiet. Ethan sat on the rug, surrounded by torn wrapping paper, explaining the rules of a new board game to two staff members who listened like it mattered. Laura leaned against the doorway, arms crossed loosely, her face relaxed in a way Richard hadn't seen since the night before. For years, this room had hosted power. Today, it hosted joy. Richard took a slow breath. I had everything the world said mattered, he thought. and nothing that actually did. He hadn't realized how loud his life had been until silence finally meant peace instead of emptiness. Laura caught his eye. "You okay?" He nodded. "Better than I've been in a long time." She smiled, small, sincere. "I'm glad." He looked down at the ornament Ethan had given him the night before. The paper star, crooked edges. His name written in uneven letters, worth more than every award in his study. "I spent my life chasing permanence," Richard said quietly. "Buildings, companies, legacies carved in stone." Laura stepped closer, and none of it held my hand when I couldn't breathe last night. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Richard watched Ethan roll a die across the rug, his face lit with excitement. It took losing almost everyone, Richard continued, to realize love doesn't knock loudly. He paused. "Sometimes it whispers," he said. "Sometimes it knocks softly at the gate in the middle of a snowstorm." Laura's throat tightened. "I almost didn't answer," Richard admitted. "I almost let fear decide." "But you didn't," she said. "No," he replied, "I didn't." Later that morning, they sat together at the long dining table, once reserved for meetings that never involved food. The spread was simple: eggs, toast, fruit, coffee poured without ceremony. Richard watched Laura cut Ethan's food the way parents do without thinking. Watched the boy chatter about school, about wanting to learn how to play piano because the mansion had one just sitting there. The house absorbed the sound like it had been starving for it. Richard folded his hands on the table. "I won't pretend to know how this works," he said carefully. "Family, I've failed at it before." Laura looked up. "So have I." He nodded. "All I can promise is honesty and effort." Ethan raised his hand like he was in class. "And snacks." Richard laughed, a real, unguarded sound that startled even him. "Yes," he said, "and snacks." After breakfast, Richard walked the halls slowly, Ethan trailing behind him like a shadow. He showed him rooms that had never been used, libraries no one read in, sitting areas designed for conversations that never happened. "Why you got all this?" Ethan asked. Richard thought for a moment. "I thought space meant freedom." Ethan nodded seriously. "But people fill space better." Richard smiled. "They do." They stopped in front of a long, empty wall. "I think," Richard said slowly, "this is where pictures should go." Ethan beamed. "We can take some today." That afternoon, snow began to fall again. Soft, clean. Laura stood outside on the steps, wrapped in a borrowed coat, watching Ethan build a lopsided snowman with 2 staff members who'd long forgotten their job titles. Richard joined her. "You could have turned us away," she said quietly. "I almost did," he admitted. "Why didn't you?" He watched Ethan pack snow onto the snowman's head, laughing when it collapsed. "Because I was tired of being right," Richard said, "and lonely." She nodded. A silence settled between them. Not awkward, not heavy. "Earned? I won't pretend this fixes everything." Laura said, "Life doesn't work like that." Richard smiled. "I know, but it's a start." As evening approached, the mansion glowed warmly against the snow. Lights twinkled. Music played softly. The tree stood a little crooked, exactly how it should. Richard stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. Sometimes family walks in when you least expect it, he thought, and saves you without trying. He turned inward, voice steady now, not for anyone else to hear, but for himself. "I spent decades building walls," he reflected, "tall ones, strong ones, expensive ones." He watched Ethan run past, laughter trailing behind him like light. And all it took to tear them down, he realized, was opening a door. That night, as snow fell heavier and the house settled into sleep, Richard placed the paper star gently into a small wooden box on his bedside table. Not as a souvenir, as a reminder. He turned off the light and lay back, the sound of quiet breathing down the hall grounding him. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something to conquer. It felt like something to share. And as the mansion rested no longer a monument to isolation, but a shelter filled with life, Richard Coleman finally understood the truth he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. Wealth can build walls. Kindness builds doors. And sometimes the greatest gift you ever receive isn't the one you give away, but the one you finally let in.